Well, as the kids are making their way out, I want to invite you, as I've already said, to open up your Bibles. We're going to be looking together at the book of Nehemiah. We're going to be looking together at chapter 4. Well, let me begin by asking you this question, though. How many of you have ever gotten to the point in your life where you are just ready to throw in the towel and to give up? Right? You've gotten to that place in your life where you're thinking to yourself, man, I don't know if I can do this anymore. You're tired. You're frustrated. You're burned out. There are all of these things that are happening, and you begin to ask yourself, I don't even know if I can do this. I mean, and this covers a wide variety of issues in life, right? I mean, it could be your health. It could be your job. It could be your finances. I mean, there are all of these different things that we go through in life that cause us to say, you know what, I don't even know if I want to deal with this anymore. And the question is, when you are discouraged and disappointed, how do you handle the discouragements that come? Do you throw in the towel? Do you look to yourself? Do you look to God? How do you handle when discouragement and disappointment set in? You know, somebody has said that how we handle adversity reveals more about our character than just about anything else. And I think we can probably see that it's true when we look at our lives and we see the things that have happened in life. We think to ourselves, how is it that I am going to handle this? How is it that I am going to make it through another day? You know, we go through life and we have to understand that discouragement and disappointment are universal. They are things that every single person has faced. Every single person at one time or another has had to walk through those discouragements. And here's one of the crazy things. How many of you have ever been in that place where you are discouraged by your discouragement? I mean, you think about it, right? All of a sudden you go through this, something happens, you get discouraged, and then you think, I can't seem to break out of this. And so you're discouraged by the very fact that you're discouraged. And so you're like, I don't even know if I can do this anymore. You just see, it feels like one thing after the next happens. And sometimes you wonder, am I alone? The good news is you're not. I mean, everybody at some point or another has had to walk through a difficult season in life. Everybody has been discouraged or disappointed at some point in their life. But how do they handle it? Now, I want you to notice something. We're going to be looking together at the book of Nehemiah. Now, for Nehemiah, if you haven't been with us over the past couple weeks, let me just kind of bring you up to speed so you understand where we're at. It's important for you to know that at the very beginning, so Nehemiah had this discontented heart for the things of God. He saw the way the world was. It wasn't as he saw God intended. And so he thought, you know, here I am, God, send me, use me, God. And so God gave him this discontented heart, and he recognized he wanted to do something. But then what happened? He knew he couldn't do it on his own. And so he dropped to his knees and he began to pray. And he said, God, I need you in this. I recognize I can't do it. And so as he's praying, though, we see this 4 months of just praying and fasting and getting ready. And then what does he do? He makes the ask. He goes to the king and he says, King, this is what I'm going to need. He risks it all. And the king not only grants him permission to go, but he gives him provision and protection along the way. Nehemiah gets there. He surveys the damage around the city of Jerusalem. He begins to organize and plan and put some things together. And as we discover, they're working on the wall. Now, see, from the outside perspective, you would see the story of Nehemiah and think, well, you know, that's the guy who, he gets to live out his dreams, right? And everything seems to be going well. And so you look at a story of Nehemiah and you think, yeah, but here's the perfect example. Somebody, he had this dream on his heart, right? And God fulfilled it. Now he's beginning to do the work. You're like, that doesn't happen to me. Because for a lot of us, it's like you go through life and it's like you start living into something and you're like, okay, God, I think this is it. I think that I'm doing what you want me to do. And then what happens? The bottom drops out. And you're like, again, God? Seriously, again? you just get so frustrated because these things seem to happen over and over again. And so you're like, I don't know if I can relate. See, because you've got the friends, you've got the neighbors where, how many of you ever had that? Everything always seems to go right for them. And you think, man, I look at my life and all I feel like is it's just one discouragement and one disappointment again and again. But here's what you need to know. Discouragement and disappointment are universal. Everybody experiences it at some point along the way. And so the question is, how do you handle the discouragements and the disappointments that come in life? And what we're going to discover today is that even for Nehemiah, even though things seem to be going perfectly well for him, even he faced challenges. And we're going to be spending our time talking about that together this morning. So, as we've been doing over the weeks past, we're going to be looking at the book of Nehemiah. We're going to be looking together at chapter 4. And so, as we're looking at chapter 4 together, as we've been doing in the past, we're not going to look specifically at the entire chapter, but we're going to be drawing some things out together this morning. And the first thing, if you're going to follow along and take some notes, I want you to see what are the causes of this disappointment and this discouragement that Nehemiah is facing. What is it that you and I can learn as we're going through that as well? If you're going to take some notes, I want you to see the first thing is that there are external causes, right? So this is that idea that there are external causes. See, there are things that are happening. Nehemiah is going through and he's doing the work. They're building the wall. If you get to verse 6, it says that they're working with all their hearts. Right? We're going to learn a little bit later on that they have finished the wall to half its height. So they're humming along. Everything seems to be going well. And yet what happens is these external things come and they begin speaking into not only Nehemiah's life, but the people's lives. You know, you look at Nehemiah, you look at the people, you look at your own life, and you're like, I'm feeling great. Somebody has said it this way, that exhilaration is the feeling you get right after that dream has been placed upon your heart and immediately before you come to your senses and realize the challenges. Sometimes you're going through life and you're exhilarated. You're like, yes, I get to do this. And then suddenly, as we've said, it seems like everything seems to be falling apart. And sometimes there are external things. And I want you to see a number of them. Notice the first thing is this, the discouragement that can come from ridicule. How many of you ever experienced that before? Right? The ridicule that can come. Notice, by the way, what does verse 1 and 2 say? What happened? When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. What does he do? He ridiculed the Jews. And in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish it in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, as burned as they are? We've been introduced to this man Sanballat before. He's the antagonist in the story, and he resorts to, if you want to think of it this way, he resorts to the language of losers, and that's ridicule. I mean, what does he do? He sees the things that are happening. What we know is that for Sanballat, he's kind of the governor. He's kind of the leader right next door. So he's worried about these Jewish people. They've not only rebuilt the temple, they've rebuilt the city. Now they're rebuilding the wall. And he's worried about his own life. Like, oh boy, here come these people. They're going to encroach on my territory. And so what does he resort to? He resorts to ridicule. One of the things that you have to understand is that ridicule is really the language of the devil. See, what it says, Scripture says that Satan is the accuser of the brethren. So, what is it that Sanballat has to turn to? He turns to ridicule. Now, this is what's so amazing. You know that ridicule is lie, right? You know that this is the language of the devil. And yet, you begin to internalize these things. You know it's a lie, and yet suddenly this ridicule you allow to begin to affect you. Because notice, there's a number of different things here. What does Sanballat ridicule about the people? Well, one of it is he belittles their qualities, right? Because he says, oh, you feeble Jewish people, you're weak. I mean, you have this dream that God has given you. You're too weak. You can't possibly do it. And what happens? You begin to listen to the ridicule that comes from these external places. You start to think to yourself, you know what? Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not strong enough. Maybe I really can't do this. Notice what else he ridicules, their ambitions, right? What does he ask? Will they restore their wall? Here are these people, they have this sense, they're rebuilding the wall, they're doing the work that God has called them to do. But he says, are they really going to do it? Really? And even though the people have worked, they worked hard, they've gotten the wall to half its height, eventually they begin to listen to this and they say, you know what? Maybe he's right. Maybe we can't rebuild the wall. Sometimes ridicule can mock your optimism. I mean, don't you see that happening? Because what does he say? Will they offer sacrifices? So the question comes, as they're beginning to do this work, they know that they're going to be offering sacrifices once again in the temple. And what begins to happen is they come, is your God really going to help you? Is he really going to help you build out of this rubble, out of the ashes, not only this temple and this wall? Are you really going to offer sacrifices once again? And what begins to happen is you hear these things and you begin to doubt. By the way, ridicule can often kind of mock your enthusiasm, right? What does Sanballat say? Will they finish it in a day? Now, did the people ever say that they were going to finish the wall in a day? No. I mean, they finished it in a record amount of time, but the people never said, we're going to finish this in a day. And yet what Sanballat says is, oh, do you really think that? But see, even though they had never said it, what happens is they begin to internalize these things and say, oh, yeah, you know what? They begin to doubt themselves. So often ridicule can undermine your confidence. Right? I mean, notice what it says in verse 3. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Can these people really bring these stones back to life again? They were what? They began to listen, feeble Jewish people. As we've said before, they weren't master carpenters. They were normal, everyday people that were called to work on the wall section by section. And so what happens when Tobiah begins to say, you know what, even if a fox steps on this wall, the work that they're doing is so terrible that the wall itself is just going to collapse. Undermines their confidence. And I would gather that all of us have experienced things like that before. The ridicule comes, and even though you know it is a lie, you begin to take those things in and listen. And you begin to say, well, you know what? Maybe they have a point. Maybe they're right. By the way, sometimes the other point is that sometimes it's the external causes, the threat of force, right? There's the possibility that something may physically happen to you. Notice what verses 7 and 8 say. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's wall had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So what happens? The verbal insults turn to threats. And the workers were constantly afraid that they were going to be ambushed. The enemies plot, right? They begin to say, we're going to come together, we're going to fight against the people of Jerusalem. It's important for us to understand. Last week we were talking about the importance of working together. And especially for believers, how hard that can be. Sometimes, if you think about a ring, right? We all want things, and we're all pulling on opposite sides of the ring sometimes. And for Nehemiah, he had to get the people to learn how to pull together. It's amazing how difficult the difficulties that Christians have around working together, but how easily the enemies of God work together to destroy the things of God. They don't have any problems working together to try to destroy the things of God. And so we have to understand the enemies that exist outside. But here's the thing, is just like the verbal threats, so often these external threats that come, and we think that there are these threats of force, we have to understand that they are false accusations. Because sometimes we have these false expectations. You and I begin to listen to the lies of the enemy. We begin to take these things in, and they cause us, we're going to come back to this again, to take our eyes off of God and to put our eyes on the problem. See, so often the discouragements, the disappointments that you and I face in life are because we have taken our eyes off of God and we look at the problem. And so the enemies come and they threaten, verbally. They threaten physically. And then all of a sudden we begin to internalize these things and say, you know what? Maybe they're right, even though we can know that they are a lie from the enemy. And that really leads us to the second idea, the internal causes. So there are external causes, but then there's also the internal causes, these things that we internalize. We hear these things and we begin to believe these lies. We believe the things that people are saying about us or against us. And so all of a sudden it's this discouragement and this disappointment set in. And notice what happens. One of them is this, it's burnout. Right? I mean, how many of you have ever gotten to the place in your life where you just feel completely burned out? Notice, by the way, what verse 10 says. It says, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. I mean, think about where they started. Verse 6, it said that they were working with enthusiasm. It says that they finished the wall to half its height. They were halfway there. And yet, what happens? They were burned out. They were tired. Physically, they were tired. And they began to listen to the lies of the enemy, and they said to themselves, we cannot possibly finish this. This is too much work for us, even though they were halfway done. The other thing is they were tired, right? I mean, not only physically were they tired, but then emotionally they were tired. The word giving out literally means staggering, right? Tottering. They were tired. And isn't it amazing how when you are physically tired, how emotionally you get burned out and you get tired as well. It's easy to become fatigued when you're tired. And so I would gather all of us have probably felt that way. You get physically tired, and then emotionally you get tired, and you say to yourself, man, I don't know if I can do this. I want you to see a second thing, is that's frustration. Right? Another internal cause is frustration. See, the first half of verse 10 talks about their physical tiredness, but then they look at it, says, and there is so much rubble that we cannot possibly build the wall. I mean, think about what happens when you're halfway through a project. Are you the kind of person who sees the glass as half empty? Or are you the kind of person that sees the glass as half full? Because what can happen is when you see the glass as kind of this half-empty thing, you look around and you start saying, I don't know if I can do this, right? I don't know if I can finish this, even though you've gotten to the place where you've finished it almost to halfway. What happens is you see the physical difficulties, and then you also get frustrated by it. It's like you get to that place where you feel like you're shoveling the same old dirt The same old brick, the same old mortar. You just keep going, and you think to yourself, I got to do more of this, right? More? I think about a year and a half ago when we were putting in tile in our house. That thought process, now I look back on it, and boy, I would dread doing that again. Because you go through it, and in your mind, you're like, wow, this is going to look so great, and this is going to be so great when we're all finished. And then it's like, you got to get another box of tile out. You got to mix up another bag of thin set. And seriously, you get halfway done, and you finish the first half, and you're like, wow, this looks so great. And then you go into the back room, and you're like, I got to do this too. You are physically tired. But I want you to see how you easily become frustrated by this. So I've never laid tile before, right? So here we are doing the work. I didn't know any better. I have never grouted in my life. So thankfully, a good friend Don comes over. He shows me exactly how we're going to put down the grout. So we're grouting, and as we're grouting together this little section, he says, I could put down hundreds of square feet of tile. I don't mind it, but I hate grouting. I despise grouting. Do you know what's so amazing is I didn't know any better, right? I've never grouted before in my life. As I get working, continuing on in the work, do you know how many times I'm mixing up, another bag of more, and I'm putting it down, and the entire time I'm saying to myself, I hate grouting. I hate grouting. I was thinking about that this week. My uncle, a retired pastor, we were talking about this probably about 6 months ago. He was saying the thing that he misses the very least about being a pastor are his Saturday nights. He said, I hate Saturday nights because I knew that by 7 o'clock I was going to be inside studying. Do you know, in 17 years, I have never once complained about a Saturday night. Until he spoke. And he said something about that. And all of a sudden, on occasion, I'll be sitting down and I'm like, these Saturday nights. But isn't it amazing how you're tired, you're frustrated, and then what begins to happen is you internalize the things that other people say. All of a sudden, you internalize them and you're like, yeah, you know what? I agree with that. This is hard. This does stink. You get discouraged and you get disappointed because you listen to the lies, to the things that other people are saying. I want you to see a third thing, fear. That's another thing that can cause you to have this internalized disappointment. Notice what verses 11 and 12 say. Also, our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and will put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us, what? 10 times over. Wherever you turn, whenever you turn, they will attack us. By the way, do you notice who are the people who get nervous the fastest? The people who live closest to the naysayers, right? So those who lived closest to the trouble were the ones who the most quickly came and said, whoa, wait a second, we can't do this anymore. It's a good reminder, right? When you hang around with negative people, you allow them to begin to speak into your life, even though in your own mind you would have never thought about it prior to that. You begin to allow these people to speak to you. And so what happens is you get discouraged. And the truth is, you're deceived. You allow fear to drive so much of your life. I was studying as I came across that this week. I want you to see if you relate to this. This is what this person said. See if you can relate to what they said about fear itself. They said 60% of our fears are totally unfounded. Could you agree with that? 20% of your fears are things that have already happened. 10% of the fears are really not that big a deal. 5% of your fears are true, and you have no control over them. and 5% of the things are true, and you do have control over them. Would you see that that's true in your life? I mean, what are the things that you are the most fearful of? And what are the things that you need to come to a place of trusting God for? See, this is that point, once again, is when you take your eyes off of God, your problems seem so much bigger. You get afraid, you get frustrated, you get burned out. This is a reminder that in the moments of your deepest frustrations, in those moments of your greatest disappointments and discouragements, we need to keep our eyes fixed on God. And that's what I want you to see. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with the discouragements that come in life? Well, notice, first of all, you pray. You pray. Notice, by the way, fifth sermon in this series, third time we've talked about prayer. Because what we see here is, once again, if you look at verses 4 and 5, what do the people do? They pray. Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. And then in verse 9, if you were to drop down there, notice what it says. But we prayed to our God. And what did they pray for? They prayed, turn their very insults back on their own heads. We talk about, loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us. We want to be all sweet and lovey-dovey. Boy, you look at this prayer, and it's like, hey, God, turn their very insults back on their own heads. But do you know why? Because remember what we said, the building of the wall around Jerusalem was about the dignity of God. And so what these men were doing was insulting the very dignity of God. And so they're saying, God, turn these insults right back upon their heads. So often when we pray, we don't want to offend God. And so we'll talk about things like, well, God, if it's your will, you don't see in here, God, if it's your will, right? Can we finish the wall, please? Or if it's your will, would you please, stop these people from attacking us? They were like, God, we need your help. Turn these insults right back on their own heads, God. You see David would always end his prayers talking about the sovereignty of God, right? Saying, God, I'm going to put my trust in you. I'm going to put my hope in you. And yet David was never afraid. If you look at the Psalms to say, but God, this is what I need. Take my enemies, turn them away, God. And when we face those difficult things in life, we are reminded that you and I need to pray. See, here's what happens. The antagonists come and they talk about you. And so what is your first temptation? To talk to them. This is a reminder, the first thing you need to do is talk to God. You pray. I want you to see a second thing. You maintain this spirit of perseverance. You persevere. If you were to go to verse 15, notice what it says. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we returned to the wall, each to our own work. You see what happens? They were being pressed in upon, right? The physical threats that were coming against them, the emotional threats that were coming against them, the verbal threats that were coming against them. And what happens? When that happens to you and I, so often we want to throw in the towel, we want to give up, we want to give in, we want to tuck our tail between our legs and say, okay, forget it, I'm done, I'm going home. But notice, what is it that they do? They kept working. They kept persevering. If you were to look at verse 21, do you know what it says? That they worked from the time the sun came up in the morning until the time when the stars came out at night. Does that sound like an 8-hour workday to you? These people persevered. They saw the work that needed to be done, and they said, we're going to get this done. Notice, by the way, a third thing, they planned. Right? They planned. If you look at verse 13, it says, therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And then I want you to drop down to verses 16 to 18, because it says, from that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. I mean, I love that. They continued the work. Now, by the way, notice the plan was different. The original plan was we're going to work section by section until we get this wall done. But then they faced opposition. And so what Nehemiah does is he changes the plan and he says, okay, now we're going to be working on the weakest sections of the wall first. But as you're working, this is how we're going to do it. By the way, I was reminded this week, I was just thinking about this. Remember the comment a number of years ago about those, Bible-thumping, gun-toting Christians? Look at this, right? I mean, think about this for a second. They're working with a shovel in one hand, and they got a sword in the other. I mean, that sounds to me like people who are ready to go to work, ready to go to war, and ready to fight. And you know what? So often, maybe there's things that are happening in your life the plan needs to change. You know, maybe you're kind of going through life and there's something going on in your relationship. Maybe it's a marriage and you're like, you've tried one thing, but maybe the plan needs to change a little bit. Maybe there's something going on in work and you've been doing it one way, but the plan needs to change a little bit. But see, no matter what it is that you're doing, you need to work at it, but then you also need to protect it. And that's what we're reminded of here, is that we need to work hard, but we also protect it. And that's how we begin going about these things. That's how we begin to combat discouragement. We don't stop. We keep pressing in. We keep fighting for the things that matter. And then fourth and last, it's important to remember how awesome God is. You know, as we're going through the text, I should have talked about this before, but I wanted to make sure we end with this because it's so important to understand. Look at verse 14 and look at what it says. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. I mean, think about that. Look at what Nehemiah said here. He said, don't, in fact, I want you to say this with me. So what Nehemiah says, say it with me this morning. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. I mean, see, that's what Nehemiah was reminding them of, is that when you're faced with discouragement and disappointment, you need to fix your eyes on God. See, so often we want to be rubble gazers, right? We want to look at the bricks that are around us, the mortar that's around us, and we want to say, I can't possibly do that. You listen to the people who say you can't possibly do that, but that's when we need to keep our eyes fixed on God, not on the problem. See, if you want to overcome discouragement and disappointment over and over again, the reminder is you have to keep looking to God. You have to keep looking up, because it's God who is going to give you the strength. What were we saying before? Strength will rise as we wait upon the Lord. We look to God, who is the source of our strength. I sent it out in our email this week. It's in your bulletin as you look at it this morning. What is it that Psalm 18:6 says? It says, I keep my eyes always on the Lord, with him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. That's how you overcome the discouragements. That's how you overcome disappointments. They're going to come, people. It's going to happen. You're going to have those moments when everything seems to be falling apart, when you just are like, I don't know if I can do this, if I can step forward anymore. You keep your eyes fixed on the Lord. At your right hand. It's a reminder that I will not be shaken. Let's pray into that this morning.